When people hear D-Day, they usually think of one date, June 6th, 1944, the day the Allies launched the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. But the truth is, the term D-Day wasn't originally meant to refer to that one historic event. In fact, it was just a piece of standard United States military jargon. The D in D-Day doesn't stand for anything secret or dramatic. It literally means day. That's right, just day. It's the day on which a combat operation is set to begin. The same principle applies to H-hour, which marks the specific hour an attack kicks off. So when military planners wrote schedules, they used expressions like D-3 or D+1 to refer to days before and after the operation. Technically, D-Day just means day-day. Sounds a little silly, right? Before June 6th, 1944, the United States and Allied forces had already conducted other operations labeled with a D-Day. There were dozens, possibly hundreds, across different theaters of the war. But this one was different. It was the biggest, most daring amphibious assault in military history, and it worked. After the success of the Normandy landings, the term D-Day became synonymous with courage, sacrifice, and liberation. The original meaning faded. Ask anyone today what D-Day means, and they'll tell you. It was the day freedom began its march across Europe. So while D may have once meant nothing more than a placeholder, history gave it meaning. In the spring of 1944, the success of D-Day hinged not just on tanks, troops, or air power, but on silence. Total, absolute secrecy. The Allies were assembling the largest invasion force the world had ever seen, and if even a whisper of the plan leaked to the Nazis, the entire mission could collapse before it began. So British intelligence and high command took extreme measures. One of the most dramatic? On March 12, 1944, the British government banned all travel between the United Kingdom and Ireland. Why Ireland? Because the Irish Free State, now the Republic of Ireland, was neutral during World War II. While they didn't support the Axis, they also weren't officially part of the Allied war effort. This neutrality created a huge security risk. British and American troops stationed across England and Wales often had connections to Ireland. Soldiers could potentially travel there on leave, write letters, talk loosely in pubs, and information could, intentionally or not, slip through. What worried Allied planners even more was espionage. Ireland had a functioning German diplomatic presence in Dublin. Military Intelligence Section 5 suspected that Nazi agents might be working out of the German embassy, listening for any clue about Allied invasion plans. A single overheard conversation or intercepted letter might reveal the date, the location, even the beaches, and cost tens of thousands of lives. So Britain acted decisively. Civilian travel was suspended. Mail was monitored. Phone calls were screened. Even coded weather reports were cut off to prevent Germany from guessing the invasion window based on atmospheric patterns. And it worked. The Germans had no idea when or where the invasion would come. They expected it to hit at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. And they certainly didn't expect it in early June, when weather conditions looked too brutal for an attack. In the end, it wasn't just rifles and warships that protected Operation Overlord. It was silence, deception, and cutting off the world's oldest unofficial backchannel, gossip. We like to imagine history being shaped by great men making bold decisions. But sometimes, even generals have to bow to the stars, or in this case, the moon. When planning Operation Overlord, the Allied commanders weren't just choosing a date out of a calendar. They were hunting for a perfect storm of conditions, celestial and terrestrial, that would give their troops a fighting chance. The timing of D-Day was dictated not by strategy alone, but by the tides, the moon, and the rising sun. Here's why it mattered. First, they needed a full moon. Why? Because thousands of paratroopers from the United States and British airborne divisions would be jumping into enemy territory before the main invasion. They needed moonlight to navigate and regroup after landing behind German lines. No moon. No way to find each other or their targets. Second, the assault required a low tide at dawn. The beaches of Normandy were littered with German defenses, barbed wire, wooden stakes, mines, and steel obstacles nicknamed Czech hedgehogs. These traps were deadly, but they were also partially submerged at high tide. The Allies wanted them exposed so combat engineers could destroy them before the infantry landed. But here's the problem. A full moon and a low tide at dawn don't happen often, maybe 3 days a month. That narrowed the possible dates for the invasion to just a tiny window in early June. The team initially picked June 5, 1944. Troops were already loading onto ships, but then the weather turned ugly. High winds, rough seas, and thick cloud cover threatened to wreck the operation. The airborne drops would be suicidal. The naval landings? A total mess. At the last moment, Allied meteorologists, led by Group Captain James Stagg, spotted a narrow break in the weather on June 6th. Eisenhower took the gamble. He gave the go, and that tiny sliver of clear skies changed the world. Had they waited one more day, the weather would have worsened dramatically, and the invasion would have been postponed for 2 more weeks. By then, German reconnaissance might have uncovered the plan. So no, Eisenhower didn't pick the date. The moon did. June 6th, 1944, the day the Allies launched the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of troops, explosions lighting up the coast of Normandy. Chaos, death, glory. And where was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the German commander in charge of defending the Atlantic Wall? He was in Germany, buying his wife a pair of shoes. Yes, you heard that right. Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, was one of Hitler's top generals. A master tactician, a man who had earned the respect of both allies and enemies alike. In early 1944, he was assigned a critical mission: defend Western Europe from an Allied invasion. But by June, the invasion scare had already stretched for weeks. German intelligence, misled by Allied deception operations, was convinced the real invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. And the weather? Absolutely terrible. Gale force winds, rough seas, thick clouds. No sane commander would launch an amphibious assault in those conditions. So on June 5th, convinced that nothing would happen for at least a few more days, Rommel decided to take a short trip back to Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday and bring her a gift. That gift? A pair of shoes. When news of the invasion reached him the next morning, Rommel was hundreds of miles away. He had to race back to Normandy in a panic, knowing he was missing the most critical battle of the war. His absence wasn't just symbolic. Rommel had been arguing with the Nazi high command for months over how best to respond to an invasion. He wanted to stop the Allies at the beach, pushing them back into the sea before they could build momentum. But other German generals wanted to hold their armored divisions in reserve deeper inland. Without Rommel on site, German command was paralyzed by indecision. The response was delayed, scattered, and ineffective. That hesitation may have cost Hitler the war. So yes, D-Day was won by Allied courage, strategy, and sacrifice. But it may have also been won by a pair of shoes. The beaches of Normandy were filled with the thunder of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, and the roar of explosions. But on one stretch of sand, Sword Beach, there was something else. Something completely surreal. Bagpipes. As British commandos stormed the French coast, one man calmly waded through the surf in full Highland dress, kilt, sporran, and all, playing traditional Scottish tunes on the pipes. His name was Bill Millen, a 21-year-old private, and he would become a legend that day. Millen wasn't just some eccentric soldier. He was the personal piper of Lord Lovat, commander of the 1st Special Service Brigade. And when Lovat led his men ashore at Sword Beach, he ordered Millen to do something no modern soldier would ever expect: play us across the water. Millen hesitated. British military regulations had banned pipers from leading troops into battle since World War I. It was just too dangerous. But Lovat wasn't concerned. "That's the English War Office," he said. "You and I are both Scottish." So Millen obeyed. Under a hail of bullets, with men dying all around him, he marched up and down the beach playing tunes like Highland Laddie and The Road to the Isles. Not ducking, not flinching, just playing. And somehow, he wasn't shot. Later, captured German soldiers admitted they had seen the piper but hadn't opened fire. Why? They thought he had gone mad. Marching around with bagpipes in the middle of a war zone? To them, it was too bizarre to be real, like something out of a dream or a nightmare. But Millen was very real. He played his comrades into battle, and many credited him with giving them the morale to keep pushing forward through the chaos and carnage. His pipes, the same ones he played on D-Day, are now displayed in a museum in France. And to this day, Veterans remember him not as a mascot or a musician, but as a symbol of calm in the storm. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon on the battlefield is courage that makes no sense at all. It sounds like a war movie too bizarre to be true. A soldier captured at D-Day, who had already served in 3 different armies, on 3 different fronts, on 2 continents. But this story isn't fiction. His name was Yang Kyung-jong, and he may be the most unlikely prisoner of war in modern history. Born in Korea in 1920, Yang was just 18 years old when the Imperial Japanese Army, which then controlled Korea, drafted him into service. In 1938, he was sent to fight against the Soviet Union in Manchuria. A year later, during the Battle of Kokon-Jeol, Yang was captured by Soviet forces. Now a prisoner of war in Siberia, Yang likely expected a miserable end, forced labor, or worse. But fate had other plans. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin needed soldiers. Lots of them. Yang and thousands of other prisoners were forced into the Red Army, trained briefly, and sent west to fight against the Germans. Once again, Yang found himself in the middle of someone else's war. And once again, he was captured, this time by the Germans, somewhere near Ukraine. But the nightmare wasn't over. In 1943, with manpower shortages mounting, the Wehrmacht began recruiting foreign prisoners into Ostbataillionen, Eastern battalions. These second-rate infantry units were sent to man coastal defenses in France, far from the Eastern Front. That's how Yang Kyung-jong, a Korean man with no stake in the war, ended up wearing a German uniform on a beach in Normandy, just in time for D-Day. On June 6, 1944, American paratroopers captured Yang near Utah Beach, utterly confused to find an Asian-looking German soldier among the defenders. At first, they thought he was Japanese. He didn't speak English. He didn't speak German. And nobody could figure out what side he was actually on. After the war, Yang was held in a United States POW camp before eventually immigrating to the United States. He settled in Illinois, where he lived a quiet life and passed away in 1992, a man who had been drafted, captured, and conscripted by 3 of the biggest empires of the 20th century. He never fired a shot for any of them by choice. When most people think of D-Day, they imagine storming beaches under a hail of bullets. But few realize that D-Day wasn't one beach, it was 5. Each had a code name, a specific Allied force assigned, and a vastly different experience. And one of them became a living hell. The 5 landing zones, moving from west to east along the Normandy coast, were Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Utah Beach was the most westerly. Assigned to American forces, it saw relatively low resistance, thanks to poor German troop placement and effective U.S. paratrooper drops behind enemy lines. Gold Beach was assigned to the British. Though they faced tough German defenses, including a massive gun battery at Lons-sur-Mer, the British made good progress inland. Juneau Beach, handled by Canadian forces, saw intense fighting. The first wave suffered nearly 50% casualties, but the Canadians fought fiercely and secured the beach by day's end. Sword Beach, the easternmost sector, was taken by the British, with support from Free French forces. Here, they encountered stiff German resistance, including an armored counterattack by the 21st Panzer Division, but managed to repel it. And then there was Omaha Beach, the beach that nearly broke the entire invasion. Assigned to the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, Omaha was flanked by cliffs, mined with obstacles, and defended by the elite 352nd German Infantry Division, while dug in and heavily armed. Allied intelligence had underestimated the enemy's strength here, badly. The result? Chaos. Landing crafts were blown apart before they even touched shore. Tanks sank under heavy surf. Units were pinned down, some unable to even exit the water. The beach offered zero cover. In the first hour alone, over 1,000 Americans were killed or wounded. Bodies piled up. Radios failed. Commanders lost contact. For a brief moment, it looked like Omaha might have to be abandoned. But the men held on. Slowly, painfully, they pushed forward, crawling over bodies, scaling cliffs, and knocking out machine gun nests one by one. By the end of the day, Omaha was secure, but at the cost of over 2,400 American casualties, making it the bloodiest of all 5 landing zones. Omaha wasn't just a beach. It was a brutal reminder of the cost of freedom, a place where young men walked into hell so that others could live in peace. One of the most brilliant strategies behind the success of D-Day wasn't just brute force, it was deception. The Allies knew that to pull off Operation Overlord, they had to keep the Germans guessing, confused, and off balance. So they created a phantom army, an entire fake force designed to trick Hitler and his commanders. This elaborate ruse was called Operation Fortitude. It involved creating an imaginary First United States Army group, supposedly led by the legendary General George S. Patton, who was widely feared by the Nazis. Patton's reputation was so strong that German intelligence was convinced that wherever he went, a major attack was brewing. But here's the kicker. Patton wasn't actually commanding the invasion force. While the real invasion was planned for Normandy, this phantom army was stationed across the English Channel near Kent and Sussex, opposite the French port of Pas-de-Calais, the shortest and most obvious crossing point from England to France. To make the illusion convincing, the Allies went all out. They built inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery that could be seen from the air. They transmitted thousands of fake radio messages to simulate troop movements and buildups. They even set up fake camps and airfields with dummy airplanes and vehicles. The Germans fell for it. Hook, line, and sinker. Even after the invasion began on June 6th, they kept large numbers of elite troops and armored divisions in Pas-de-Calais, expecting a second, bigger attack. This meant fewer German forces were available to defend Normandy during the critical early days. Patton's Ghost Army was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It bought the Allies precious time, reduced the strength of German counterattacks, and helped turn the tide of World War II. In the chaos of D-Day, confusion was a weapon just as powerful as a rifle or a tank. One of the most clever and downright bizarre tricks the Allies used to confuse the Germans involved parachuting hundreds of dummy soldiers behind enemy lines. These weren't ordinary mannequins. Known as paradummies, they were designed to mimic real soldiers landing by parachute, complete with equipment and weaponry. But the Allies took it one step further. Each dummy was rigged with small speakers and pyrotechnic devices. As the dummies floated down and landed, these speakers would emit the sounds of battle, gunfire, shouting, explosions, creating the illusion of a large airborne assault taking place in multiple locations. The Special Air Service and other airborne units used this tactic to mislead the Germans about the size and location of the real paratrooper drops. The ruse forced the German defenders to split their forces, sending troops scrambling to fight phantom battles while the real Allied soldiers pushed forward. These paradummies created fear, chaos, and hesitation. German troops fired at the fake soldiers, wasting precious ammunition and energy. The distractions allowed actual paratroopers to regroup and disrupt German communications and reinforcements. The paradummy operation was one of many deceptions that made D-Day a masterpiece of both strategy and trickery, proving that in war, sometimes what your enemy thinks is happening is just as important as what is happening. When we talk about D-Day, the numbers often feel staggering. About 2,500 Allied soldiers killed on June 6, 1944. But what if that number only tells part of the story? What if the true human cost was much higher? Official casualty reports from D-Day list roughly 10,000 Allied casualties, which includes those killed, wounded, or missing. Among these, approximately 2,500 were fatalities. But recent research by historians and military analysts suggests that the actual death toll may be closer to 5,000 or even higher. Why the discrepancy? There are several reasons. First, the fog of war made record-keeping incredibly difficult. Many soldiers who were missing in action may have perished without confirmation. Some bodies were lost at sea or buried in unmarked graves. Others were mortally wounded but died days or weeks later. Second, records from German forces are incomplete or lost, meaning the number of German deaths during the landings and subsequent battles in Normandy remains uncertain. Third, medical and support personnel, as well as civilians caught in the crossfire, are often excluded from official tallies. Despite these uncertainties, the sacrifices made that day were immense. Each number represents a life cut short, a family forever changed, and a story of bravery against overwhelming odds. D-Day was more than a military operation. It was a turning point drenched in blood and courage. Remembering the full scale of its cost honors those who gave everything for freedom.